Hey everybody, welcome back. Informal music corner discussion time. We're back in the corner talking about a subject that has kind of fascinated me in recent years, something that I've been mentioning on social media and in other videos that I was meaning to talk about for a while, and that is the Internet Core album. So what do I mean when I say Internet Core? There's a lot of terminology out there that can get really confusing. Well, Internet Core albums are kind of a term that people have come up with for records that are exclusively popular online, or at least the initial burst of interest comes almost entirely from online. Now, this almost always starts in places where music fans gather digitally, sites like Best Ever Albums, Rate Your Music, and Album of the Year, but it also will seep into music places on social media, on Instagram and Twitter, where alternative genres of music and indie genres of music are discussed in more detail. That's where these albums often take off and reach more towards the masses. And as much as I hate to say it, you do have to give a little bit of credit to 4chan's music board for some of these records and the popularity that they have acquired, even though that board does tend to exaggerate the alternative nature of their tastes and can be very, very predictable. Occasionally something will seep through in some of the records we're going to talk about today, where 4chan is pretty influential in the rise of their popularity. So the first way that this phenomenon can happen is with records that predate the modern internet. A lot of these albums come out in the 90s or the early 2000s, and yes, they are received well, at least initially, by those who hear them, but they have taken on another life during the internet era. And the best example I have of this is the Duster record Stratosphere. I imagine when I say a word like Internet Core for old heads or older people, this is probably one of those records that comes to mind, because forgetting the very, very early internet where people on IDM boards were discussing selected ambient works, this is one of those albums whose popularity is strongly tied to its online cult-like internet fame here in 2021. Go to a music meme page on Instagram who is talking about depression or sadness or a breakup or even taking a long shower, and I promise you're gonna catch some Duster. But it's not exclusively about music that encourages and satiates depression, because the Fishmans live album and kind of Fishman's entire discography is way more prevalent and famous online than anywhere else, but particularly this live album, the last concert that they ever recorded before their lead singer passed away, as well as the live version of probably their most well-known and acclaimed piece, Long Season, which shows up on this live album. This thing has kind of become an internet age indie darling. It is extremely highly rated on those music sites that we were talking about earlier, and a lot of people kind of consider it to be an essential part of 90s music canon, whereas if you asked most people who lived through the era, even if they were alternative rock or critical acclaimed music fans at the time, they would probably disagree. The same can be said for the 2000s, where we have Sweet Trip's Velocity.Design.Comfort. This is probably the shakiest logic of all of these, because not only does this record come out in the age where the internet is already pretty prevalent in culture, but it also does have quite a bit of fans, does have quite a bit of supporters, people who were around right at the time when this record came out. But much like Duster, what popularity and acclaim it had at the time is completely dwarfed by how much people on the internet worship and love and adore this thing in 2021. Even so far as the fact that Sweet Trip just showed up with a new record this year for the first time in ages, and it's like they hadn't missed a beat, as particularly with their fan base. Everyone was talking about this thing, eating it up. It was a pretty big deal online and in music circles, and you wouldn't think it had been that long since Sweet Trip made an album, but that is just the impact that Velocity.Design.Comfort has on people. So the first really interesting piece of internet history that we're going to talk about today is Panchiko with the record Deathmetal. No, this is not a death metal record, despite what the title may make you think. I suppose you could describe it as emo. Flavors of Midwest emo, hints of little minimalist hints of electronica work their way into this thing. This was initially released in 2000, an EP, just a short selection of tracks. The band Panchiko really wasn't around for that long, but this music was essentially completely lost to time. The band was relatively unsuccessful in their small market, broke up, separated, and just went about their lives. But it was years later, I think almost 15 years later, that someone in a secondhand store dug up a CD copy of Deathmetal that had been victim of bad CD rot. These songs were incredibly compressed because of something that had happened to the CD over those years. And these versions of the songs made it to 4chan, made it to the internet, were eventually uploaded to YouTube, and kind of developed a big cult following. I remember hearing these on YouTube, the title track Deathmetal, and just falling in love with the rotted version of this song, the just minimalist, lo-fi, insane mystique that this track has when you just rip out all of the postured and clean parts of its mixing and its arrangement and compress the hell out of it. It's fascinating. So yes, this is a band who was literally building a fan base entirely online, and until just last year, they didn't even know about it, I don't think. Someone finally tracked down the members of this band, the people responsible for this music, who thankfully had original mastered versions of these songs, and now all of it is on Spotify. You can hear both the rotted versions and the original on streaming services, and I highly recommend it. It's an incredible story that this music was unearthed, that it's so good, that it sounds so ahead of its time, and the series of coincidences necessary to get the final mastered versions of this thing and make them released publicly. It's kind of amazing. It's one of my favorite stories to tell people in all of music right now. So getting more into the modern era of internet core, we have records and genres and places where internet music can live and breathe more freely, primarily Bandcamp as a platform. Working in tandem with places like SoundCloud and YouTube, you really can exist entirely digitally, and there are entire genres that do so, like Vaporwave and Death Dream, for instance. But Bandcamp is also where we get what I would consider the godfather of the modern era of internet core albums, an album whose fiery devotion from its fans entirely online propelled the man and his band behind the record to major label success and ultimately musical fame. But it took a while because this album came out in 2011, and it really wasn't until 2016 that the band broke out to the masses. Obviously, I am talking about Car Seat Headrest and their internet core classic Twin Fantasy. Last night I drove to Harper's Ferry and I thought about you. There were signs on the room said. This is a lo-fi indie rock epic coming of age concept album. There's all kinds of stories about Will Toledo recording guitar parts in his car and all of the lo-fi tools and materials that he had to mix and master and create this record. They eventually redid it in 2018, redid the entire album with a full might of a recording studio budget behind them, but there are still little idiosyncrasies about Twin Fantasy that I just adore. The original raw, lo-fi, almost uncut rendition of Twin Fantasy that initially blew up on Bandcamp. I think this record is extremely, extremely important, even if most people didn't know it at the time, for the development of internet culture, how it interacts with music, how it promotes and shares music online. And while this thing has become a big meme because of its furry album cover and some silly lyrics here and there, I think it is absolutely incredible. I cannot understate just how much Twin Fantasy did for all of the records we're going to talk about throughout the rest of this video. And yeah, let's do it. Let's talk about some of the modern records that I think have really defined being internet core, starting with the Molchat Doma. I think I'm pronouncing that right. Molchat Doma is this goth and post-punk and like new wave project that completely has taken off online. You can see all kinds of memes. I hate to go back to memes, but they're so important to internet culture. You can see all kinds of memes, think pieces, blog reviews, places talking about this record, which I'm also not even going to bother with trying to pronounce. And yeah, until the day where I learn anything about this band from like a magazine or a publication rather than an independently run music blog or like an Instagram meme page, I think this record is pretty strongly considered internet core. Next up is the album that a lot of people credit with ushering in a new wave of emo music, Weatherday's Come In. Another total masterpiece, which I absolutely, absolutely adore. This thing kind of caught fire online. I know the first time that I heard about it was through Rate Your Music or Best Ever Albums or somewhere where I was just reading one after another glowing review for this music, which is raw, which is explosive, incredibly loud, strange and surreal in its mixing. The Persona samples that make their way into the thing are funny, even though I've never played a Persona game in my life. And just the whole attitude of it, I can't help but be incredibly impressed by the sound and the songwriting, everything that Weatherday does on this record. And if you like this record, while you're here, check out another record that is super big on the internet and supposedly a new wave of emo, the first Glass Beach album, also comes pretty highly recommended.
Here it is again, a heart of excitement in the form of a...
And of course you knew that I was gonna talk about the album that I can't stop talking about recently, the album that I keep tweeting about and keep bringing up in videos because it's kind of amazing. Parannoul, To See the Next Part of the Dream. Yes, this record, uploaded anonymously onto Bandcamp by a Korean student, has caught fire. I first got wind of it on Rate Your Music, then I saw it climbing up the Best Ever Albums charts. Pitchfork gave this thing a really glowing review, and by that point I was like, okay, Parannoul, gotta check it out. And it absolutely blew away any expectations I could have possibly had for it. This record is loud, brash, thematic, shoegazy, incredibly intense, and it also delivers on a really impassioned lyrical focus and concept throughout the record. The ideas that are being put on display here are internet self-deprecating culture 101. Even with this record being in Korean and reading the lyrics rather than listening to the lyrics, I feel the anguish in the vocal performances on this album. I feel the ways that they are mixed and arranged are heightening the drama is not the right word for it. The harrowing self-deprivation that is all over this album, and it, while I think it is technically the concept of Parannoul, the artist behind Parannoul looking towards themselves in the future, it is hard to not take some of this critique at face value and feel for what they're going through. And yeah, the language barrier can be tough at points when you're trying to break down the nuances of the concept, but after reading every interview I could find with the person behind Parannoul and listening through to the record a number of times, listening through to the other Parannoul record to try and collect some musical and thematic context, I am just so impressed by this album. And that really is the thing that makes internet core music so fascinating. I mean, you can be a band who broke up 20 years ago and your CD is dug up out of a crate at a secondhand store, and then boom, you're Panchiko, you're back, you're having hundreds of thousands of streams and people talking about how great your music are. Think pieces. Everyone is considering Panchiko. Or you can be Parannoul and come out of nowhere and make this great record just as a student without any actual instrumentation, with all digital instrumentation to craft just this record that people are relating to and loving and calling one of the best albums of the year, which it no doubt is. So what can we learn from this? I don't know. I suppose if you wanted to make the next great internet core record, there are a couple recurring themes. A lyrical concept that runs throughout is very important. A lot of people find the music of Car Seat Headrest and Parannoul to be extremely relatable. But to that end, a record like Duster isn't really wowing you with any kind of lyrical concept, so that's not a necessity. You could say that a lo-fi mix is important. A lot of these records have it. A lot of these records are maximal in their sound. Some of the clipping sounds and the purposefully rough mixes that these records have are a factor that certainly attracts people. But honestly, my takeaway from this is that the internet really is allowing that promise that is so often given to artistic creators and creative innovators, that if what you're making is that good, people will hear it, people will see it. When I look at records like Parannoul and Panchiko, it really reinforces that fact to me. And selfishly, it makes me wonder as a reviewer how I could more efficiently be combing through Bandcamp and rate your music to find the next great gem, the next great internet core album. So yes, there are probably hundreds, if not thousands, of niche genres and albums that could be comfortably considered internet core that I could have talked about. I tried to focus on some big ones, some ones that I think are really, really visible in online music scenes. Leave a comment on Twitter or on YouTube and tell me what some of your favorite internet core albums are, what you think of it as a concept. It's not really a genre, but if it were a genre, what kind of classifications would you define as an internet core album being? And I'll be back in business sooner or later, maybe for another discussion or maybe for the big one in September.